The phone rang just as I was finishing the last bite of my reheated stew. The television murmured in the background, another story about rising home prices in Portland. I reached for the receiver and saw my daughter's name flash across the screen. Amanda. "Hey, Dad," she said brightly. "Just checking in. How are you holding up tonight?" Her voice had that practiced warmth, the one that used to comfort me but lately sounded rehearsed. "I'm fine, sweetheart," I told her. "Just dinner in the news. Nothing exciting. That's good. Remember to eat more vegetables, okay? And maybe we should talk about getting someone to stop by once in a while just to help out." I smiled at the concern I thought was genuine. "You don't need to worry about me, Amanda. I'm managing." There was a pause, then the sound of shuffling a purse zipper voices. I almost hung up when I heard her again, faint and unguarded. He left the burner on again. "It's not safe, Lucas. He's getting worse." A man's voice, calm and calculating. "The house alone is worth nearly $900,000 now. If we sold it, we could move him somewhere decent, somewhere that doesn't smell like dust and old wood." Amanda laughed softly. "It's time. He's a burden, Lucas. We can't keep waiting." My hand went still. Every word sank like a nail through my chest. The line stayed open, her laughter echoing down the wire until it became silence. I sat in Martha's old recliner, staring at the photo of my late wife above the mantel. The maple trees outside whispered in the night wind. "They think I'm a burden," I said aloud. Then I looked at her picture and whispered, "All right, Martha, let's show them who they're dealing with." That night the house felt different. I turned off the lamp beside Martha's chair, but the shadows didn't soften. They lingered along the walls like old memories refusing to fade. Outside, the rain had started, thin Portland rain, the kind that whispered against the windows instead of pounding. The kind Martha used to say sounded like forgiveness. I sat there for a long while, listening to the rain and the clock, the two oldest voices left in this house. The clock had been Martha's anniversary gift walnut frame brass pendulum, steady as her heartbeat used to be. Now it just counted the seconds between what I'd heard and what I couldn't unhear. I poured myself another cup of lukewarm coffee, though it didn't taste like anything. My hands shook only once when I reached for the mug, then steadied. I was an old man, yes, but not a helpless one. The line between those two things felt thinner tonight than ever before. Across the room, Martha's photo watched me from the mantel. I'd taken it on our 25th wedding anniversary when her hair was silvering, and her smile still had the weight of laughter behind it. She'd told me once that a house only stays warm as long as it's filled with love. Now it was filled with silence and the faint echo of my daughter's laughter calling me a burden. The house creaked as the wind shifted. Floorboards I'd nailed down myself, joints I'd tightened with a craftsman's precision, all groaned as if sharing my ache. The air smelled faintly of wood polish and rain of dinners long past and conversations long gone. I rose and walked through each room slowly, as if I were visiting a museum built from my own life. The living room still carried the faint dent in the sofa where Amanda used to curl up with her schoolbooks. The coffee table oak, hand-sanded until the surface gleamed, still bore the scar from the time she spilled nail polish when she was 15. In the kitchen, the same light flickered above the sink, the one I'd been meaning to fix for months. Martha's old recipe cards sat in their tin box, each one in her looping handwriting. Lemon pie, extra zest. Chicken stew, slow simmer. I traced the edges of the cards, feeling their softness from years of use. Every corner of this house had her touch, her patience, her faith in me. And now my daughter wanted to sell it, to cash it out like a tired investment. The refrigerator hummed faintly behind me, and for a moment I thought I could smell Martha's perfume. Not really smell it, of course, but remember it so vividly that it filled the air. I closed my eyes and saw her standing there in her apron, laughing at some joke I'd told. "You and your stubborn pride," she'd said once. "One day that'll keep you standing when nothing else will." She was right. When the coffee ran out, I filled the sink and washed the cup carefully, setting it upside down on the rack. Martha had always hated seeing dishes left overnight. The little routines stayed even after she was gone, rituals of a marriage still echoing through the walls. Upstairs, the hallway smelled faintly of cedar. Amanda's room was just as she'd left it, yellow walls. Photos of friends, a bookshelf full of paperbacks she'd promised to come back for. She never did. The dresser still held the tiny mirror I'd installed for her 16th birthday, the one she used to fix her hair before dances. I ran my fingers along the windowsill I'd carved myself. The paint had faded, but the craftsmanship held. 25 years ago, when Amanda took her first steps in this house, Martha had said, "You built her a world, Henry." And I had believed her. I walked back to our bedroom, mine and Martha's. The quilt she'd sewn still covered the bed. Her nightstand held a stack of unread books, a glass of water, a bookmark frozen at page 247. I hadn't moved a single thing since the day she left. "Promise me you'll take care of yourself," she'd whispered that last night, her hand trembling in mine. "And don't let them take advantage of you. You're too kind for your own good." I'd promised. But kindness, I learned tonight, could rot if left unguarded. I opened the drawer beneath the nightstand and took out the old folder, property papers, receipts, tax records, all neatly labeled in my handwriting. I'd kept them because Martha believed in being prepared. "You never know when life will test you," she used to say. The house deed sat on top, its edges yellowing with time. Henry Walker, it read. Just my name now, no co-signers, no shared title, mine alone. I stared at that line until the words blurred. It wasn't pride that filled me, just a heavy, quiet relief. The kind that comes from realizing something no one else can take away from you. In the stillness, I heard Martha's voice again, soft and certain. "Don't give her so much that she forgets to be grateful," I whispered back. "You were right, Martha. You were right." Outside, a gust of wind pushed rain against the windows. I went to the glass and looked out over the street, the same street where I'd taught Amanda to ride her bike, running behind her until she found her balance. The lamplight shimmered on the wet pavement. "They think I'm helpless," I murmured, "but they've forgotten who built this house." The clock downstairs chimed midnight. I turned off the light, leaving the room in the same gentle dark Martha had loved. Downstairs, I paused by the front door, hand resting on the brass handle she'd chosen because it felt warm to the touch. For the first time in years, I didn't feel old. I felt awake. Something in me, quiet, patient, long buried, had started to rise. I sat at the edge of the bed for a long time, hands folded, thinking of all the years that had led to this quiet house. For 40 years, I built homes for other people, real ones. Framed beams poured foundations, measured corners, until my back ached and my fingers split open. I knew every kind of wood grain by touch alone. Yet somehow I never imagined the hardest structure to maintain would be a family. Amanda never saw most of those years. She saw the results, the Christmas lights, the tuition checks, the way the refrigerator was always full, even when work was slow. I used to come home late, covered in sawdust, and find her asleep on the couch with her school books scattered around her. Martha would drape a blanket over her shoulders and whisper, "Someday she'll understand what you've done for her." I waited decades for that understanding. It never came. When Lucas lost his job, I didn't hesitate. I loaned him money, paid for their rent when they said it was temporary. When their car broke down, I used my savings to fix it. I told myself it was what any father would do. But maybe I'd stopped being a father somewhere along the way. Maybe I'd just become a safety net. The thought sat heavy in my chest. I walked to the closet and found Martha's old cardigan still hanging there, the one she wore when she'd garden on cool mornings. I pressed it to my face, breathing in the faint scent of lavender. "You were always the strong one," I murmured. "You saw what I couldn't." The house creaked again, another small reminder that everything built, no matter how solid, eventually shifts. Downstairs, the clock ticked on. I could almost hear Martha's laughter, woven into the sound, a whisper between beats. Maybe she was telling me what I already knew. It was time to stop mourning and start remembering who I was before the world taught me to be gentle. 25 years ago, this land was nothing but mud and cedar roots. Martha and I bought it with the kind of faith only young couples have, the kind that ignores logic and listens to dreams instead. We couldn't afford contractors, so we became our own. I drew the blueprints on the kitchen table of our rental apartment using Martha's sewing ruler because it was the straightest edge we owned. She laughed when I told her we'd build it ourselves. "You can't build a whole house with just stubbornness, Henry." I told her, "Watch me." Every weekend we drove out here in our rusted pickup truck. Martha brought sandwiches wrapped in wax paper and a thermos of coffee that always tasted like comfort. She carried buckets of nails, read instructions from the manual, kept track of expenses in her tiny notebook. I can still see her standing there, hair tied back, jeans rolled up, sunlight turning her into something golden. When the foundation was poured, she clapped her hands and said, "That's our future, right there in concrete." And she was right. Amanda was barely 3 then. She'd toddle around the site in her little yellow boots, picking up small stones and calling them Daddy's treasures. Sometimes I'd stop working just to watch her chase butterflies through the half-built frame. Martha would scold me gently. "If you keep staring at her like that, we'll never finish this place." But I didn't care. I wanted to remember every second. The day we raised the first wall, it rained. Oregon rain, thin and constant. The wood swelled, the tools slipped from my hands, but Martha kept handing me nails one by one, refusing to let me stop. By dusk, we stood there soaked to the bone, our first wall upright behind us. She leaned against it, laughing through the rain. "See, you can build a house with stubbornness after all." Those years blurred into sweat and sawdust. I worked 2 jobs, construction by day, repairs by night. Martha took a part-time position at the library cataloging books while I mixed concrete under halogen light. We lived on soup and second-hand furniture. But every nail I hammered carried a promise that one day Amanda would never have to struggle like we did. When the house was finally done, we had nothing left in savings, but we had walls that held our laughter. Martha filmed Amanda running through the hallway yelling, "It's my castle." Her little voice still echoes somewhere in these rooms. I swear it does. We didn't throw a party, just the 3 of us sitting on the floor eating soup straight from the pot. Martha leaned her head on my shoulder and said, "It's not perfect, but it's ours." Years later, when Amanda was in college, Martha found the old camcorder tapes. We watched them one evening by the fire. She turned to me and said, "You built her a world, Henry. Don't ever let her forget that." I didn't know then how impossible that promise would be. When Martha got sick, the house changed. The walls that once echoed with laughter began to whisper instead. I built ramps, added handrails, turned our bedroom into something between a home and a hospital. Some nights she'd wake up and ask me to open the curtains so she could see the moonlight on the yard. "It's beautiful," she'd whisper. "Don't let her sell it someday." I'd laugh softly, thinking she was joking, but her eyes stayed serious. "Promise me." "I promise," I said, and I meant it. She passed on a Sunday morning when the rain stopped and sunlight finally touched the porch she'd painted herself. I remember her last words as clearly as the sound of my hammer striking wood. "Don't give her so much that she forgets to be grateful." Now, standing in the same house, I realized she had seen further than I ever could. I walked to the bay window Martha loved most, the one she'd insisted on because she said every family needed a place to dream. The glass reflected my older face, but for a moment I saw her beside me again. "You were the heart," I whispered. "I was just the hands." And she forgot both. By morning, the decision had settled in me like steel. I woke before dawn the way I used to on job sites and brewed coffee I didn't drink. The world outside was gray and silent, the kind of Portland morning that feels older than time. I dressed in my best coat, the one Martha used to press for church, and left the house without turning on a single light. The office of David Lowell, attorney at law, sat above a bakery on Hawthorne Boulevard. I'd met him once years ago when Martha wanted our will revised after her diagnosis. He had kind eyes then. He still did when he looked up and recognized me. "Henry Walker," he said, standing to shake my hand. "It's been a while." I was sorry to hear about Martha. I nodded. "Thank you. She always said you were the only lawyer who talked like a human being." He smiled faintly and gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "What can I do for you today?" I told him everything: the phone call, the overheard conversation, the laughter. Every word I'd held inside since that night spilled out steady and cold. David didn't interrupt. He just listened, pen resting on the pad but never moving. When I finished, he leaned back and exhaled. "I wish I could say I'm surprised, Henry. But I hear stories like this every week. Stories like mine, families, property, control." He tapped his pen once against the desk. "Let's start with the basics. The deed still in your name." I nodded. "Martha and I paid it off 15 years ago. When she passed, it transferred fully to me. Then legally, no one, not your daughter, not her husband, can make decisions about that property without your written consent. They can't sell it, mortgage it, or move you out. Unless you sign something, you hold every right." The words hit harder than I expected. "So if I wanted to sell it myself?" He smiled. "You could? Tomorrow, if you wished." The idea hung between us like smoke. I stared at the wood grain on his desk, thinking of every nail I'd driven. Every night I'd fallen asleep to Martha's breathing in that house. "Would you help me with the paperwork if I decided to..." I can prepare everything? But Henry, he studied me for a long moment. Are you sure that's what you want? Once it's sold, there's no going back. I met his eyes. They called me a burden, David. They've already gone back. He nodded slowly, understanding something beyond the words. Then let's make sure this is done right. When I left the office, the smell of bread from the bakery below filled the air. For the first time in days, I felt hungry. Back home, I walked through the rooms again, but this time I saw them through another lens: square footage, light exposure, renovation potential, not memories, but value. It was strange and liberating at once, like viewing my own life as an architect's blueprint, clean, detached, measurable. I searched online for real estate agents, scrolling past smiling faces until one caught my eye. Mark Jensen, Portland Homes Group. His clients praised him for quick, discreet sales and fair cash offers. I called the number listed beneath his photo before I could talk myself out of it. Mark Jensen speaking. His voice was brisk but not unfriendly. Mr. Jensen, I said, my name is Henry Walker. I'm considering selling my home. How quickly can these things happen? That depends, he said. But Portland's market is strong right now. If your property's in good shape, we could close in as little as 10 days. Tell me about the house. Built in 1999, I replied. 2 stories, 3 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, cherry wood floors. I built it myself. There was a pause. You built it yourself, yeah? Every board, he whistled softly. That kind of craftsmanship sells itself, Mr. Walker. May I come by for an assessment this afternoon? I looked at the clock, nearly noon. 3 o'clock, I said. Perfect. I'll see you then. When I hung up, I glanced around the living room. Dust floated in the sunbeams like tiny ghosts. I opened the windows, polished the oak surfaces, straightened the curtains Martha had sewn. Not for vanity, just habit. She would have wanted the place tidy for visitors. At exactly 3, the doorbell rang. Mark Jensen was younger than I'd expected, mid-40s, pressed suit, confidence like perfume. He shook my hand firmly and stepped inside, his gaze sweeping across the entryway. This is immaculate, he said almost under his breath. You really did build this yourself. I nodded, every inch. He ran a hand along the banister, studying the joints. They don't make homes like this anymore. He moved through the house, methodically tapping walls, noting details on his tablet. Original hardwood cherry. Martha chose it because she liked how it glowed in the morning light. He smiled. She had good taste. We moved into the kitchen, and I watched his professional admiration mix with genuine respect. He crouched to inspect the cabinets, checked the granite countertops, and said, Mr. Walker, I think you're sitting on a gem. Homes like this, condition, location, story, they don't stay on the market long. What kind of value are we talking about? He scrolled through comparable listings on his screen. $875,000 to $900,000, maybe more with the right buyer. I nodded slowly. Listed at $890,000. His eyebrows rose. Are you sure it could go higher? I'm not trying to win a war, Mr. Jensen. Just end one. He studied me for a beat, then said quietly, I'll handle everything personally. As he left, I noticed my reflection in the glass door, an old man, steady, composed, not broken. That evening, Amanda called. The timing was perfect, almost rehearsed. Dad, I was just thinking of you. How's my favorite retiree? I forced a chuckle. Still kicking. How's Seattle treating you? Oh, the conference is exhausting, she said, voice sugar-sweet. But Lucas and I were talking. Maybe when we get back, we can help you look at some better living options. You know, places that have nurses on site. Sounds thoughtful, I said, as if the knife hadn't already twisted. I'll think about it. That's my dad, she said brightly. Always so reasonable. When the call ended, I sat in silence, the phone still warm in my palm. For years, I'd thought reason was what held families together. Now I knew better. Sometimes the only way to be heard is through action. Before you judge me, remember, sometimes silence is the loudest justice. The next morning, Mark returned with a folder tucked neatly under his arm. He'd brought coffee too, black strong, the kind realtors drink when they're closing a deal. We can move fast, he said, spreading papers across my kitchen table, the same one Martha and I had eaten on for decades. There's an investment group looking for properties like yours. Cash buyers, no inspections beyond a walkthrough, 10 days to close. 10 days. I nodded, keeping my voice even. Let's do it. Mark hesitated for just a second, maybe expecting me to waver, but I didn't. He slid the documents toward me, page after page of tidy legal print, and I signed each line without pause. When the pen left the last page, he smiled. "Congratulations, Mr. Walker. You've just sold a home worth nearly $900,000. The words sounded unreal, like they belonged to someone else's life. I stared at my name beside the signature and thought of Martha's hand steadying mine the day we'd signed the original deed 25 years ago. Back then, we'd been building a beginning. Now I was signing an ending. Mark packed up the papers, still talking about timelines, wire transfers, title searches. I barely heard him. My mind was already elsewhere on Amanda's voice, her laugh, the word burden, echoing inside these walls. After he left, I sat at the table tracing the faint rings left by old coffee mugs. The house was quiet, but not empty anymore. There was something alive here again, a purpose, maybe even defiance. I whispered to the walls, "Let's finish this right, Martha." Then I folded the sales copy neatly and placed it beside her photograph, the ink still drying like a fresh wound. The closing took place 3 days later in a narrow office above the river. A notary sat across from me, patient, efficient, guiding me through each document with the calm precision of someone signing away an old life. Mark was there too, bright-eyed, already thinking about his next deal. "This is the deed transfer," he said, "and this one acknowledges the wire transfer. Funds will hit your account before end of day." I initialed, signed, moved to the next page. The sound of my pen was steady, deliberate. When it was done, Mark shook my hand. "Congratulations, Mr. Walker. You're free, free." The word felt strange, weightless, and heavy all at once. By the time I walked out, the rain had stopped. The sky hung low and gray, the kind Martha used to call forgiving weather. I drove home for what would be the last time, the dashboard clock ticking louder than the engine. Inside, everything looked the same, chairs, curtains, picture frames. But it wasn't mine anymore. The air itself had changed. I moved slowly from room to room, saying goodbye the only way I knew how. In the kitchen, I ran my hand across the counter where Martha used to knead dough. In the living room, I touched the edge of the bay window she'd insisted on. Upstairs, I stood in the doorway of Amanda's old room. "You'll always have a place here," I'd told her when she left for college. Now, even that promise was gone. I packed a single suitcase, Martha's jewelry box, our wedding photo, her cookbook with notes in the margins, the small hammer I'd used to build the stairs. The rest I left behind. By late afternoon, I called the storage company. "Pack everything with the last name Walker," I told them. "Delivered to Beaverton Storage. Paid in advance." They didn't ask questions. People rarely do when money's good. That evening, I drove to my new apartment, a small unit in Beaverton's senior community, furnished and clean, smelling faintly of lemon polish. The manager, Mrs. Chen, was kind but brisk. "You'll like it here," she said, handing me the keys. Quiet, safe. Quiet, safe. Words people use when they mean forgotten. I spent the night unpacking what little I'd brought. Martha's picture went on the nightstand. Her cardigan hung in the closet. I opened my laptop on the small table and logged into my bank account. $890,000. Dollars, numbers on a screen detached from the years they represented. I stared at them for a long time, then whispered, "You were right, Martha. Never give them everything." The next morning, I made my final trip back to the house. The new owners wouldn't take possession for another week, and my key still worked. For now. The sun had just broken through the clouds when I parked in the driveway. The garden Martha planted was blooming wild lavender sage and the last of the tulips. I walked to the porch and unlocked the door. The air inside smelled of lemon cleaner, distant and unfamiliar. Their luggage sat near the stairs, Amanda's red suitcase, Lucas's black duffel. They'd dropped them off before leaving for Seattle, assuming they'd return to a house still waiting for them. I almost laughed at the irony. I opened the small box I'd brought and pulled out the camera charger, a device so ordinary it could hide in plain sight. I plugged it into the outlet beside the front door and angled it carefully, testing the feed from my phone. The lens caught everything: the doorway, the floor, the note I'd soon tape to the wood. Satisfied, I opened my notebook and began to write. "Dear Amanda and Lucas, if you're reading this, it means my plan worked. I heard your conversation, the one where you called me a burden and discussed selling my house. You'll be relieved to know the house has been sold for $890,000. The funds are in my account, safe and out of your reach. Your belongings are stored at Beaverton Storage. You have 30 days to claim them before fees apply. I gave you everything: time, money, faith. You repaid me with betrayal. I hope this lesson stays with you longer than my forgiveness ever did. Love, Dad. I folded the note neatly, sealed it in an envelope, and taped it at eye level to the inside of the door. The ink was barely dry when I whispered, "Justice served," and stepped outside. Before leaving, I turned the key one final time, locking the door from within and pulling it closed behind me. The sound of the latch was soft but final. Back in my apartment, I placed the phone on the table, camera feed open. The empty entryway stared back at me, a stage waiting for its players. Friday came bright and clear. At 5:12 p.m., the motion alert buzzed on my phone. A black SUV pulled into the driveway. Amanda stepped out first, hair perfectly arranged, sunglasses still on despite the dim sky. Lucas followed, dragging their luggage. I watched through the screen as she approached the door, humming casual. She reached for her key. It didn't fit. Her brow furrowed. She tried again, twisting harder. The lock didn't move. Lucas joined her irritation, flashing across his face. "Maybe you're using the wrong one," he muttered. "This is the house key," she said, voice sharp. "He must have changed the locks. Why would he?" He stopped her with a gesture and circled around back. A minute later, he returned, breathless. "Back door's locked too. Garage remote doesn't work either. What I'm telling you, everything's changed." Amanda's face drained of color. "Call Dad." She dialed. The line rang, then clicked to silence. She tried again. No answer. Panic began to flicker in her eyes. He wouldn't just... Her voice cut off when she saw the envelope taped to the door. She tore it down, ripped it open, and read aloud. Each line changed her expression. Confusion, disbelief, horror. "He sold it," she whispered. "He sold the house." Lucas grabbed the letter, scanning it. His voice turned flat. "He took everything." Amanda's breath hitched. "That money was our future." "Your future," he snapped. "You're the one who called him a burden. You pushed for this. My fault. You said the same thing." They were shouting now, their voices echoing through the house they no longer owned. I watched quietly, my reflection faint in the phone screen. For a moment, Amanda crumpled the letter in her hands and sank onto the step. Lucas stood over her, shaking his head, muttering curses. Then silence. He looked around the entryway one last time, as if the walls themselves had turned against him. "She was right," I said softly to the empty apartment. "You can't build gratitude with money." I closed the app, poured a small glass of Martha's favorite wine, and raised it toward her photo on the nightstand. "To you, my love," I whispered. Justice served. The wine was sharp, dry, alive. Outside, the Portland evening faded into gold. They had called me a burden. Now they would carry the weight instead. The sun had almost set when I finally drew the curtains. The apartment was small, but it held enough light to see Martha's picture clearly. For the first time in years, her smile didn't hurt to look at. I sat in the chair by the window and listened to the distant hum of traffic, to the quiet that comes when the world stops asking anything from you. The old anger was still there, but softer now, cooled into something that felt like peace. I thought about Amanda and Lucas, how they'd stand in that empty house surrounded by memories they never earned. Maybe someday they'd understand. Maybe not. But understanding wasn't part of my plan. Outside, a train horn echoed across the city, fading like a memory that no longer needed to stay. I reached for Martha's wine glass again, the one she'd used on our last anniversary, and raised it to the quiet air. "For you," I said. "For what we built." The city lights blinked on in the distance, one by one, steady and patient like the house I'd left behind. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't waiting for anyone's approval. The storm had passed, and in the silence that followed, I felt whole again. That night, the rain returned, not the kind that floods or breaks branches, just a steady whisper against the window, soft and patient, like someone reminding me the world was still turning. I didn't turn on any lights. The apartment felt better in the dark. Martha's photo sat on the table beside the half-empty glass of wine. The air smelled faintly of cedar from the new furniture, too clean, too unfamiliar. I leaned back in the chair and listened to the rain. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to fill the silence. It wasn't victory that sat in my chest, not satisfaction either, just stillness. The kind that comes after a storm when even the birds forget to sing. Somewhere across the city, Amanda and Lucas were standing in the ruins of their certainty. I didn't imagine their faces. I'd already seen enough through the camera. Instead, I thought of her when she was 6, running down the hallway of our unfinished home, her tiny feet slapping against the plywood floor. "Look, Daddy," she'd said, holding a handful of wildflowers she'd picked from the lot next door. "When I grow up, I'll buy you a big house, one with a swing and a lake." Martha had laughed, brushing dust from my hair. "She means this one, Henry. She already owns your heart." I smiled at the memory, though it came with a sting. Somewhere along the years between that wildflower promise and the phone call that broke me, something in her heart had gone quiet. Maybe mine had too. I'd spent decades building walls strong enough to hold a family, but I'd never learned how to build boundaries. Every need Amanda had I met. Every mistake I fixed. When she cried, I handed her comfort instead of consequence. Maybe that was my real failure. I thought about what Martha had said on the day we poured the foundation. "This house will be strong, Henry. Just promise me you'll be just as strong when life tests you." I hadn't been. Not until now. The clock on the wall ticked softly, a hum under the rain. I found myself speaking to the empty room. "You'd hate this little apartment, Martha. No garden, no sunlight." But then I smiled. "You'd love that it's quiet." I got up and opened the small cabinet near the sink. Inside was the notebook Martha used to keep her recipes. I flipped it open, and between lemon pie and roast chicken, I'd tucked a page from my old construction journal, the one I used to measure every beam, every plank of our house. The handwriting was younger, bolder. At the top, Martha had scribbled a note years ago. "Built with love. Keep it that way." I ran my thumb over the words. "I did, sweetheart," I whispered, "until the end." Outside, thunder rolled faintly over the Willamette River. I sat back down, opened a clean page in my notebook, and began to write, not to Amanda, not to the world, but to myself. I didn't lose a house. I kept a promise. I didn't destroy her future. I protected my own. Love can't survive without respect, and respect can't live where gratitude dies. I read the words aloud, the sound steady in the quiet room. For a long time, I'd confused kindness with surrender. I thought being a good father meant always saying yes, always carrying the weight, always forgiving. But forgiveness without understanding only teaches people how to take more. Maybe that was the lesson Martha had tried to leave me with. I closed the notebook and looked out the window. The city lights shimmered on the wet pavement like reflections of a life still moving forward. Loneliness used to frighten me. Now, it just meant peace. Loneliness is when you wait for someone to come back. Peace is when you stop waiting. I didn't know if Amanda would ever call again. Maybe one day she'd try, maybe not. But I'd stopped waiting for apologies that never came. In the quiet, I whispered to the rain, "She's still my daughter, Martha. But I'm done being her lesson." The storm outside softened to a drizzle. The night grew warmer, calmer. I poured the last of the wine into Martha's glass and lifted it to the window, watching the reflection of the city flicker in its surface. "For you," I said again, "for what we built, and for what I finally learned to protect." The clock struck midnight. I smiled faint but real, and added one final line to the page before closing the book. "I'm not rebuilding a house. I'm rebuilding myself." You've ever built your life for someone else, remember, it's never too late to reclaim what's yours. Morning came soft and silver. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets rinsed clean. I brewed a single cup of coffee and opened the window. Cool air drifted in, carrying the faint scent of wet pavement and pine. For the first time in years, I didn't have anywhere to be. No phone waiting to ring. No one expecting anything from me. Just a quiet morning and a heartbeat steady enough to trust again. I walked outside with my mug and stood beneath the awning. Across the courtyard, an elderly couple was tending to a row of potted herbs. The woman smiled and waved. I found myself waving back. It felt strange, simple kindness with no strings attached, not obligation, not debt, just two strangers acknowledging the same piece of sky. I sat on the bench near the entrance and watched the world wake up. Cars moved slowly through the wet streets, their tires hissing against the asphalt. A young boy rode past on a scooter laughing. Somewhere a dog barked impatient for attention. Life, it seemed, hadn't noticed my absence at all. And maybe that was the point. The world keeps building itself whether we stay or not. All we can do is make sure what we build inside ourselves is worth keeping. I finished my coffee feeling the warmth fade from the cup. Then I whispered to the morning air, "I kept my promise, Martha." And for the first time in a long, long while, the silence answered back with peace. Morning sunlight spilled across the table, soft and golden, catching in the rim of Martha's wineglass. For the first time in a long while, I didn't flinch at the light. It felt like permission. I brewed coffee and left the radio off. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was simply space. Space to breathe, to think, to exist without waiting for the next disappointment. The air smelled faintly of rain and roasted beans, clean and ordinary in the best way. Outside my window, the courtyard shimmered with dew. The old couple from yesterday were already tending their plants. The woman wore a sun hat far too big for her head. The man balanced a watering can with trembling hands. They moved slowly, like time itself had learned to be gentle with them. I stood there for a while, coffee warming my palms, watching them in quiet awe. They didn't need grand gestures or words, just shared routine, shared air. I realized then that love wasn't built in the big things. It was built in mornings like this. When I finally stepped outside, the world greeted me with a cool breeze and the faint scent of wet earth. The street was alive again. Bicycles, passing dogs, tugging at leashes, children laughing on their way to school. I walked with no destination, just the rhythm of my steps keeping time with my breath. Near the corner cafe, a little boy dropped his toy truck into a puddle. I bent down and picked it up before he could start crying. "Here you go, champ," I said, handing it back. His mother smiled gratefully. "Thank you, don't mention it." I started walking again, but the boy's laughter followed me down the block. It echoed faintly like Amanda's laughter once did when she was that age. For a moment it didn't hurt to remember. The city felt different now. Not smaller, just quieter inside me. I could finally walk through it without the weight of expectation pressing on my chest. I passed a construction site where men in hard hats were raising new beams. The clang of metal, the hum of machinery, it all felt familiar, like music I hadn't heard in years. One of the workers shouted a measurement, and instinctively I muttered the correction under my breath. Old habits don't die, they just wait for you to return. Martha's voice came back to me then, not from memory, but from somewhere deeper. "You did what you had to do, Henry. You kept your word." I stopped walking. The sunlight flickered through the scaffolding, laying bars of gold across the wet pavement. For a second, I could almost see her standing there, hands on her hips, that knowing smile softening her face. "I wasn't sure you'd forgive me," I whispered. "You don't need forgiveness." The wind seemed to answer. "You just needed to remember who you are." I smiled, the kind of smile that starts in the chest and climbs slowly to the lips. When I returned to the apartment, I left the door open for a while. The smell of coffee and rain drifted in, mingling with the faint scent of Martha's lavender sachet. On the table lay my notebook. I opened it to a blank page and began to write again. The promise wasn't about the house. It was about remembering who I was when I built it. Martha knew that. She just wanted me to find my way back. I paused, listening to the quiet. Somewhere outside, a bird sang, high, insistent, alive. I wrote another line. "We build houses to keep love safe, but sometimes love survives only when we let the walls fall." The words settled on the page like dust after construction final calm. I leaned back in the chair, feeling something unfamiliar move through me. It wasn't regret. It wasn't pride. It was renewal. I thought about calling Amanda. The idea came gently, without bitterness. Maybe not today, maybe not ever. But someday, when the silence had taught her what words never could, maybe she'd understand. I closed the notebook, placed it beside Martha's photo, and whispered, "You can rest now, sweetheart." I finally did it right. Outside, sunlight stretched across the courtyard. The old couple sat together on their bench hands, intertwined heads close. The sight made me ache, but softly this time, like a memory that knows its place. I picked up my jacket and stepped outside again. The air was cool, the day wide open. As I walked down the path, the city sounds rose and fell around me. Ours footsteps, laughter, wind, all of it blending into one long, steady rhythm. For once, it didn't feel like noise. It felt like life. And for the first time in a long time, I walked toward it instead of away. I reached the corner and stopped beneath a maple tree. Its leaves were turning the same shade of copper Martha used to love in autumn. The wind carried them gently across the sidewalk, each one spinning like a slow apology from time itself. Above me, the sky cleared wide and impossibly blue. The clouds parted and sunlight spilled through warm against my face. I closed my eyes and breathed it in. For the first time in years, I wasn't looking back. Somewhere in that warmth, I could almost hear her voice again, soft and proud. "You finally came home, Henry." I smiled. Not because I believed in ghosts, but because I believed in her. Then I kept walking slow and steady into the light that waited ahead. Evening crept in slow, laying gold over the quiet walls of my apartment. The day had passed without noise, without ache. I'd spent most of it sitting by the window, writing in my notebook, drinking coffee that had gone cold long before I finished it. When the phone rang, I almost didn't answer. The sound felt foreign now, like a voice from another life. Henry came David Lowell's familiar tone. "Sorry to bother you this late. Something came in the mail for you. I thought you might want to see it sooner rather than later." I frowned. "From me, yes, from your daughter." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. "Do you want me to forward it?" he asked gently. I hesitated, then said, "Please." The envelope arrived the next morning. No return address, just my name typed neatly across the front. Inside, there was no letter, no apology, no excuses, only a single photograph. It was old, sun-bleached at the edges. Martha stood in the middle, laughing. I was beside her, one arm around her waist, younger, thinner, full of purpose. And in front of us, Amanda, no more than 7, holding a small wooden sign I'd carved myself, "Walk her home." I traced the outline of her tiny hands gripping that sign. The smile she wore back then was unguarded, wide, pure. I hadn't seen that smile in decades. For a while I just sat there, the photo trembling slightly between my fingers. Then I said aloud, maybe she finally remembered. I placed the photo beside Martha's frame on the nightstand. The two of them belonged together. Outside, Portland was beginning to glow. Streetlights flickered on, one by one, reflections rippling across the wet pavement like scattered stars. I leaned back in the chair and let the silence settle again. This time it wasn't heavy. It felt like forgiveness finding its way home. Through the open window, the wind shifted, carrying the faintest echo of a voice I knew by heart. "You kept your promise, Henry." I smiled and whispered, "So did you." The city lights blurred behind the glass, warm and steady, as if the world itself was exhaling. Voices fade, but guilt echoes louder. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to Echoes of Betrayal. Thank you for listening and for keeping these voices alive.